Thank you, thank you. That was a great panel. Excellent. And now we have a topic, global cyclical and structural risks. Yes, that's challenging indeed. Well, I'm very happy to have as our moderator at this session a former colleague at the Fed, Don Kohn, who has a long-standing and very distinguished career as vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. He's now at the Brookings Institution, known to all of us as one of the outstanding members of the Fed. And we'll now move on to this very challenging topic with what I call several individuals who have played and continue to play leadership roles in the issues we're talking about, not just passive but active leadership roles. They are Gurria and Tharman, Shanmugaratnam, and Jean-Claude Trichet, three of them together, who will be discussing these issues. And with that, Don, turn over the stage to you.
Thank you, Dick. It's a great pleasure to be here. We're going to have a few opening statements from the comments from the panel, and then we'll have some discussion, then open the floor for questions. So I think the main topic here, we say, is global cyclical and structural risks. I think a good starting place for the discussion is, why is global growth so low? What's going on? What are the risks from here on out? What insights can the panelists bring to the particular areas that they're most familiar with on this? So I'm going to start at the end. Angel, do you want to say a few words on why is global growth so low? How much is structural? How much is cyclical?
Well, thank you, and delighted to be back with so many good friends. It is very low, actually lower than we thought. We just reviewed our projections for 2016 and came out under the IMF. We're at 2.9. We always were lower than the IMF anyway. They've adjusted towards us, but we've gotten lower. And we think 2017 is going to be about 3.2. So again, nothing to write home about. But it's not just about low growth. We call them the legacies of the crisis, in a way. We're still 8 years into the crisis. We're still living the consequences. So slow growth is one of the manifestations. Again, perhaps with the exception of the United States, still very high levels of unemployment practically everywhere. 10% in the euro area or thereabouts, and 9% in many of the countries. But also, when you're talking about the youth, you're talking about 3 or 4 times the average. So you're talking about 20, 30% unemployment, and even a typical European country doesn't have to be the ones with high unemployment like Greece or Spain. And then you have growing inequalities. I don't know, how many times does the income of the lowest 10% fit into the income of the highest 10%? Well, how about 10 times? Well, a generation ago, 25 years ago, it was 7 times. So inequalities have risen by that score. You can say there are better ways, but in one generation, we've increased inequality by 40%. And again, that has implications on education and on people who are at a disadvantage, do not invest enough on themselves, and therefore they become, unequal, and they become disadvantaged, etc. So, and then what has been the big engine of growth in the last decade? Well, hasn't it been the emerging markets? Well, we know the story. Brazil is in second year of recession, so is Russia. China is at about half the cruising speed of the last 10 years, and probably more sustainable though, but still. And many of the developing countries, including my own, much below their initial target, simply because the environment is more difficult. And you have this very serious destruction of trust, which is another very problematic, because everything becomes so difficult to sell to the people. And what you have is a very serious social fragmentation. You have a very serious perception that we're not delivering, that globalization is not delivering. You saw today some of the headlines in some of the newspapers saying globalization, you know, at stake, globalization sliding back, whatever. Globalization is like oxygen, you know, you can't blame it for anything. We've created the conditions. But if you consider that trade is growing at 1.7% per year instead of 7%, then you understand a little bit about what's happening. Or that investment is at about half speed, maybe still below the levels of foreign direct investment, below the levels of pre-crisis. Again, the institutions, what did we create over the last 100 years? Presidents, prime ministers, ministers, parliaments, banks, multinationals, democracy. And we find it so difficult even to remind people that this is what it's about and to keep it. We lost Brexit because we did not focus on the right issues and did not take the threat seriously enough. We did not focus on the fact that there was a backlash against immigration. There was a very deliberate effort by the British government not to focus on the discussion of immigration because that was what the opposition was using. We didn't focus on that, we lost it. And we just lost the discussion on the referendum in Colombia because only upwards of 35% went to vote. You know, in Brexit, the fate of the young was at stake, and they didn't vote. And in Colombia, the fate of the country was at stake, and only 37% went out to vote. And, well, of course, we had a very shock. The guys on the wrong side always go to vote. The guys on the wrong side, well, they are, you know, they are just, but everybody else is comfortable, everybody else is so, you know, there are a number of issues. As I said, we're still suffering the consequences. And these are just the numbers. These are perhaps what I would call the manifestations. I think the greatest problem that we have today is that given the political fragmentation, we have relatively weak leaderships. You see the very strange transition going on in the United States. By the way, we're not going to pay for the wall. Going to be huge. Is it? But the question is, look at Spain. You know, they're close to the third election in a year, and look at Italy with the referendum, with the Renzi, which is going to be, you know, about him because he suggested it, that it was his, you know, fate. The UK, of course, struggling to just get not the right answers, but the right questions about Brexit, you know, how to move about it, how to deal with it. A hardening of Merkel and Hollande now on the other side of Merkel herself, weakened by the question of the migration issues, etc. So, and the problem is, what does a leadership of that kind, how much can they do in terms of taking bold decisions? Problem is, you can be anything but bold because you have very little room for maneuver, because if you are bold, then you lose a few more votes, and then if you lose a few more votes, you lose your majority. And so this is, in the end, it's not that we don't know what to do about it, but it would look like there's little room in order to get there because of the consequences of what we didn't do. But don't blame globalization, please. Globalization has nothing to do with it. It's that we did not get the policies right, and that perhaps we did not get the mix of productivity, which is in a shambles here in the United States, is negative. we did not get the mix right between productivity / inclusiveness and the nexus between the two. And now, I suppose we're paying the price.
Let's come back in the discussion to the what to do. We've had some analysis. Tharman, do you have something to add on why we're in the fix we're in?
So I think Angel has described the broad landscape extremely well. Let me just zero in on two issues. Can you hear me, by the way? At the back?
Yeah,
Is it working? Not so well, apparently. Let's speak up. It's not picking up very well.
No, it's better.
Okay. Yeah, why not? First, I think the big fact is that private investment is weak all over the world, much weaker than you'd expect it to be 7 years after the crisis. It's weak even in the United States, where the recovery has progressed to the greatest extent. And everywhere in the world, private investment has not responded to extraordinarily easy monetary policy in the way the models would have predicted. So something has changed in what the economists call the transmission mechanism from interest rates and monetary policy to credit growth, and from credit growth to fixed investment growth by the corporate sector. Something has changed, and we don't quite understand this. It's not as if companies aren't borrowing in places like the United States. They are borrowing, but they're not using the borrowed funds on fixed investment, not in the way they used to. There's very extensive share buybacks. Payouts are extremely high. In fact, payouts out of free cash flow are more than 100% in many instances. So something has changed. And the models don't capture it, and many of the traditional frameworks within which central banks operate with the best of intentions haven't quite worked out, haven't quite been able to predict what's been happening. We now have a situation where there's some circularity between this weakness in private investment and the weakness in productivity growth. You're not investing as much because the returns on investment are not as high as they used to be, because productivity growth is weak. But productivity is also weak because investment rates are not what they should be. So you've got to find some way of breaking out of that circularity, and it will involve going beyond traditional macroeconomic responses to structural responses. And I think there's ample space in domestic policy. There's ample space left in domestic policy, both demand side and supply side, to be able to break that circularity and reignite private investment. It does mean what we broadly call structural policies, but they also play a very useful demand-side role. Larry was speaking earlier about infrastructure. That's a very obvious area. But even what we do to improve the mismatch or to reduce the mismatch in skills in the workforce between those who are looking for jobs and those who are coming out of school, and the types of skills required in the labor force, which is a huge mismatch almost everywhere in the world, at least in every major economy, a huge mismatch. Even what we do there will be able to raise employment rates, raise productivity at the same time, and raise GDP growth, which is a combination of employment growth and productivity growth. So there's plenty scope, in my opinion, to reignite private investment, but it requires a refocusing on structural policies, and these same structural policies will also be, they're not just supply-side policies, they're also policies which can stimulate demand by reigniting private investment.
Jean-Claude.
Well, first of all, let me say that I am very much in agreement with all what has been said. We are in a situation where we are disappointed. I would only nuance a little bit, because if we compare to the first half of 2000, of course, it's miserable. But we know now that the first half of 2000 was excessive. And it was a period where we were piling up public and private debt to an extent that we could unfortunately experience the worst crisis, financial crisis, ever since World War II. could have been the worst financial crisis ever since World War I. And we have to be fully aware of that if we want to understand where we stand, which is extraordinary because 8 years after Lehman Brothers, the monetary policies are still incredibly accommodating. And there are reasons, good reasons for that. I would say six and a half years after the start of the sovereign risk crisis in Europe, we are in the same extraordinary situation, and there are good reasons for that. So we really have to understand. I would say, if I would sum up, because we have a very limited time, I would buy part of the secular stagnation hypothesis that Larry explained very rapidly. I would say that the legacy of the crisis itself is still there, as you just mentioned, and is something which is very, very important to understand exactly where we stand. And I would buy also Tharman idea that there are a lot of structural reforms that we should do and we do not do in all the advanced economy and beyond the advanced economy, because let's not forget that we are speaking of a financial crisis of the advanced economy, but also in the rest of the world, in the emerging world. So all that being said, we are in a situation where it seems to me that the difficulty for embarking on structural reforms is considerably amplified by the frustration of our people. That was also mentioned, of course. Brexit on the one hand, populist move in all advanced economy without any exception. I don't see any country in Europe, out of Europe, in the US, out of the US, in the euro area, out of the euro area, which does not have exactly the same phenomenon of very, very powerful drive of populist anti-globalization move. I think it's the main political problem that we all have to cope with. It's absolutely clear. It could go very far and maybe destroy what we still consider, at least I would say in probably the consensus of the Bretton Woods Committee, as something which is essential to provide stability and prosperity, namely appropriately handled globalization. But my own understanding is that there are very good reasons for this frustration. And I would sum it up in terms of speed. Things are going too rapidly for our fellow citizens, for many of our fellow citizens. Of course, nobody would not say that the rise of China, India, and all emerging world is not very good. It's exactly what we wanted after World War II. The World Bank, Jim, was created for that. The success is fantastic. But our people are feeling it is a little bit too rapid. In a way. Technology is absolutely striking, will continue to be striking. I was told that the new generation, the G5 after G4 for the mobile, will multiply by 100 the flows of bits, multiplied by 100. So it will, again, change dramatically all what we are doing at the present moment. And not to speak of other marvels of science and technology, but the stress on our fellow citizens is absolutely dramatic. And I could add up, formidable success, including the longevity, the duration of our life, which is going fantastically well, if I may, but creates, of course, additional problem for our own fellow citizens. The pensions problem is a problem that I experience myself in all my successive jobs as the major problem, even when you can explain that it is, of course, not challengeable, that we have to take into account the longevity growing. But all that being said, only to mention the fact that we really have, in my opinion, to improve formidably communication in terms of structural reforms. And one of the difficulties, in my opinion, is that it is exactly like fiscal policies. There is no single motto at the level of the world or at the level of any continent. You have to say exactly what you mean. In Europe, the situation of Germany is not the situation of Spain or the situation of Italy, not to speak of my own situation in France. So clearly, you have to be much more specific than saying the central bank have done enough, now the turn of the fiscal policies. Because the recommendation might be exactly the contrary on a country-to-country basis. activating domestic demand. When you are speaking of a country, of a continent like the euro area, with plus 3.5% of current account surplus, it means something. Clearly, you have to activate domestic demand. I'm not sure, maybe I'm not politically very correct, but I'm not sure that in the US you should do that necessarily from a macro standpoint. You are in deficit by minus 2.5%. And this is also part of the recommendation at the global level, which are not the same, it seems to me, from a continent to the other continent. And again, in the emerging world also the situations are very diverse. So one of my, and I would conclude on that, my message would be beware of single mottos at the level of the world or at the level of any continent. And of course, it's a temptation for the international institutions to have mottos and to simplify their communication.
I'm struck by a couple of things. One is everybody's emphasizing structural reforms. Sometimes I'm concerned that that's kind of a magic word, a thing we bring out and say you have to do it. At the same time, maybe it's hard to do some tough structural reforms like labor market flexibility reforms when the level of demand is as low as it is. When the unemployment rate's at 10%, it's hard to do those reforms. And it's maybe hard to do those reforms when people are alienated from their governments. You have to trust somebody to get the thing done. So I think there's tension here between people don't trust their governments, and we want the governments to do some very major things to change the very structure of the product and labor markets in order to get growth going. And some of those things may actually cause a little bit of a dip in growth before they cause the catch-up. I don't know. I know.
Let me say that I don't think we have a choice. And now I'll go very specific. Education. Skills, which is education, which is the innovation, which is the regulations, but it's also vocational training, lifelong learning. We have millions of young men and women unemployed and companies going out complaining that they can't get the right skills.
All right.
And this happens everywhere, even in the places where you have structural shortages like Japan or even the United States, which for practical purposes is in full employment, but where you have some shortages regionally. The innovation. Are we doing enough? So to spread out innovation, we know now that the innovation, meaning the inventions and technological breakthroughs, etc., are not trickling down as fast as they should. There are a number of issues around that which we can address. But you mentioned labor productivity, the labor reform, product reform. And yes, when you are in a hole, you do flexibility in the labor market, you increase the unemployment. But that's exactly what a country like Spain did, finally, because they did it late. But now Rajoy is generating, even without a government, 500,000 jobs because they did a reform 4 years ago. And Renzi finally did his Jobs Act, and regardless of the other political issues, now they're going to be, you know, I worked with Berlusconi twice, with Prodi. I worked with Mario Monti, with Letta. The only one who had the political condition to basically move on the labor front, labor reform, was Renzi. He did it, and they're going to get the result, but they're going to get it in 2 or 3 years' time. Again, it takes time, but it's the only way. But how about, for example, competition? How many of the countries are constrained by the fact that they're not open enough and they're not allowing for competition? The regulation. And how can you have competition without regulation and regulation without competition to be reciprocally, mutually reinforcing? Since the crisis, countries have adopted 1,400 different measures that are protectionist. that's precisely the opposite to what we should be doing. No surprise, of course, trade is going down. You're a frequent traveler to the G20 meetings, and we say, stand still, roll back of protectionism, and everybody kind of goes out the meeting to take the next protectionist measure. It's then, for example, R&D, the tax structure, the way we do with the financial system. Did we over-regulate it so that now we're having a problem with the flows of credit, especially to the small and medium enterprises? Why is debt and capital not flowing to the infrastructure and long-term infrastructure and the PPPs, et cetera? What are the big issues there? To what extent is it an FSB issue, which is regulatory in nature? To what extent is it a question of, once they say in Mexico, once you burn yourself with milk, then you even blow on the yogurt, you become overly cautious. So these are specific issues, and practically all of them apply. And the ultimate paradox, as we need them more, they are slowing down in terms of the adoption of the reforms. There's a fatigue, you can call it 8 years into the crisis. We measure this. We measure to what extent countries continue to take this and to take decisions and adopt the reforms. And they are slowing down. So there's a big paradox that is happening. Again, we should not be surprised,
Well, the protectionism itself is partly a function of the slow growth. So it's very hard to cut into this thing and speed up growth to resist the protectionist pressures. And one of the issues is getting demand high enough. So now we worry that, is there enough monetary policy space? Is there enough fiscal policy space with the aging demographics to take the steps that are needed in so many places in the world to get demand up so that you might reduce some of the resistance to globalization? Tharman, do you have some thoughts on these conundrums?
So I think something is happening in the politics of the center everywhere in the world that is not just reflecting problems on the ground, not just reflecting the anxieties that ordinary people have, but is accentuating it. Larry referred earlier on to the fact that, contrary to history, Republican supporters are now, by the way, the mic is not working. Larry referred earlier on to how, contrary to established tradition, the Republican supporters in the US were now against free trade and free trade agreements. The Democrats roughly unchanged, but the Republicans have switched, so when you take the population as a whole, there's been a shift. But just a year ago, I've been looking at these surveys. Pew does surveys, Gallup does surveys, Washington Post together with ABC did an extensive survey. Just a year ago, a very significant majority of Republicans supported free trade and trade agreements. An event happened between July 15 and where we are today. Something happened. It wasn't structural. It's not that more people became unemployed. In fact, less people are unemployed.
Right.
It's not as if the problems are getting worse. But politics matters, and bad politics reinforces people's fears. So it's not just that politics is reflecting people's anxieties, but it can actually reinforce and accentuate people's fears. And we talk ourselves into a funk. Mm-hmm. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I'd make is taking off from what Angel was saying about spreading innovation. We now know that there are a lot of positives happening in our economy near the frontier, in every industry. Near the frontier in every industry, there's remarkable innovation taking place. Yeah. But it's not being spread to the rest of the economy. So the reason why productivity growth overall is weak And I know there are measurement issues, but the best efforts show that the measurement issues don't change the trend. Basically, we do have low and declining productivity growth. And it's because something has changed. Something has changed in the way productivity and innovations spread from the frontier to the rest of the economy. We don't quite know why, but even with flexible labor markets, which you have in the United States, more or less, even with free goods markets and an open economy, something has changed in the way in which innovation spread from the frontier to the rest. And it does require a new sort of activism in industrial policy. Not protection, not creating national champions, but ways in which we can speed up learning from the frontier to the rest of each sector, each cluster. It's a new role for government. It involves coordination. It's not just public sector. It's obviously inherently public and private sector. It involves community colleges, universities, firms, and workers themselves. But we have to find ways in which we speed up learning, because there is learning and experimentation and innovation taking place, but it's not spreading the way it used to. And I think that is a rich area for public policy going forward. It's market-friendly, it supports the market, it supports restructuring, and it's not the politics of either the left or the right. It's firmly in the center.
I think in the United States, I think competition is part of it also.
Yeah.
So what we're finding in the U.S. is that our labor markets are less flexible, or there's less movement within the labor market, and there's less entry and exit by smaller firms in the economy. And that's where, of course, the innovation occurs. And we don't understand that. So yes, education is part of it, but there are other mysterious areas. And I do think government, and one thing the Obama administration and others have identified, is the number of licenses you need to open even a small business. It's not as, the U.S., particularly the service sector, is not as open and welcoming to innovation and new businesses as it ought to be. So there are a whole bunch of policies here. I think one thing I worry about is, Angel and Tharman, you took as given that the underlying rate of productivity growth was continuing to be very rapid. I think that's an open question, whether the technology really is moving that rapidly. And one explanation of weak capital spending would be businesses don't see a lot of new technological advantages to renewing their capital equipment. And that they have sensed that the long-term rate of growth of the economy is considerably lower than it has been for the last few decades, and therefore they don't need to build all this capital. So I think there's some very I don't have answers to this. I'm just the moderator. I pose the questions, right?
But Don, I have 3 points. Don, do you consider that we know now for sure that the productivity progress have considerably slowed down, and that, as Tharman was suggesting, it is something which we can explain? I'm reading a lot of papers, a lot of academic research, and there are really two schools. One school says we are probably under-assessing the real growth and the productivity, which is progress that are associated with the real growth, because the replacement of atoms by bits is something which we never experienced in the past, and it's not sure that we are measuring things correctly. The example of music is one of the most striking, because the contribution of music to GDP is shrinking when the consumption of music is expanding considerably. So let's be perhaps a little bit more cautious. I say that to nuance a little bit, because I'm not sure that scientifically we are sure where we stand in this respect. That doesn't mean that the stress of our fellow citizens is not augmenting year after year, and that the political problem which was mentioned is not augmenting year after year, and that the protectionist and populist move is not very powerful. But maybe, again, we are in a world which we have still a difficulty to fully understand. My second point would be that part of our problem is very, very low inflation and threat of deflation. I hope that we are now out of the threat of deflation the world over, but low inflation is there. I suggest that perhaps associated with globalization, we have a weakening, a secular weakening of the bargaining power of labor, which is an enormous problem. Japan will never go at the level of 2% of domestic inflation if the wages and salaries are accepted by social partners as flat. It's impossible. So we have there a problem which we see in all our countries, and perhaps we have to reflect. From time to time, I'm thinking maybe the central bankers should have also messages to social partners. And it's been the case. In Germany, the Bundesbank said, maybe you should be a little bit more demanding in the negotiation. And my last point is only to mention something which has not been really noticed, but which I found rather extraordinary and, of course, provisional. Growth in the United States this year is considered by the IMF 0.1% lower than in Europe, in the euro area, which is, I mean, it is something which is profoundly abnormal because only demographics makes a difference. But I note that, and I also noted that in their projections for 21, we have 1.6% for the US and 1.5% for the euro area, which is absolutely miserable. So to confirm that at least apparently we are in a very, very meager growth, nothing is more striking. Eh?
And I think at least in the case of the U.S., this is a supply side potential GDP problem. Maybe there's some mismeasurement, but it's deeper than just the, and whether the mismeasurement is worse now than it was before, it's very hard to tell. So, but are you arguing that central banks can't get to their 2% inflation targets until labor unions are stronger? I don't, is that what you're arguing?
In the case of Japan, I really think that this is probably decisive. And in the case of Europe, it's true that if you do not have a domestic inflation in Germany and domestic inflation going at the level of 2 or even a little bit higher than 2, because 2 is the average in the medium term, if you do not have appropriate, I would say, dynamics of the wages and salaries, you don't get that. So I don't mean, of course, that the central bank should say, now we have finished the job, up to you, but it's one of the dimensions. Structural reform is one layer. Appropriate fiscal policy, which are not the same, again, country by country, is a second layer, a very important layer. A third layer might be social partners negotiation. And of course, on top of that, there are other messages, particularly being specific on the structural reforms. Because structural reforms is a slogan, is a motto, and as Tharman said, we have, and you, Angel, we have to see exactly what we say. Education, training, labor flexibility. In Europe, you have countries that have labor flexibility and countries that are very inflexible. And the hampering of growth through inflexibility of labor is absolutely dramatic, of course.
Right. Does anyone else have any comments on this?
Just to add a nuance, you know, the whole model of targeting a certain rate of inflation higher than what we have today is aimed, at least in part, on the idea that it would, if inflationary expectations are set at a suitably high level, it will spur, if inflationary expectations are set at a suitably high level, it will spur greater consumption today. It hasn't quite worked out that way. Certainly hasn't worked out in Japan, hasn't worked out in a number of other countries. And part of the reason we think has to do with demographics. As people get closer to their retirement years, they start thinking very hard about that stream of income that they want in retirement. The low interest rates and inflationary expectations have a very different implication for someone who's in the baby boom generation approaching retirement compared to someone who's much younger. And I think this whole area of demographics, which we haven't actually built into our thinking on macroeconomic policy, now needs to be incorporated in a systematic and structural fashion. We need to build it very systematically into our thinking. It's unprecedented what we are going through, because the world has never aged before. It's never aged before, and it's now aging. It's the first time it's ever happened. It's aging already in the advanced economies. The US less so, but the US is getting there as well. Japan has already gone past the tipping point. Germany has gone past the tipping point.
Korea is going there.
Don't forget that the whole of Eastern Europe, with Russia inside, has also gone past the tipping point. We are in a new situation, and our thinking about how macroeconomic policy influences consumption and investment has to now be revisited.
And perhaps another reason for the weak capital spending, if businesses look out and see declining markets in the future. Another
Let me just, because you were talking about the wages and trade negotiation and unionization. And, the trend towards lower unionization is perhaps inevitable as our economies are moving into the services sector. The nature of the services sector, of course, do not encourage unionization. But you also cannot, we've been pushing in Japan and we've been pushing elsewhere where you say, go to the 2%, go to the 3%. There's already a kind of a built-in caution, a built-in prudence. And at the same time, if you don't get the productivity, you can only sustain increases in wages so long. In fact, what happened in Europe was that France, Italy, Ireland and Greece and everybody, is this in terms of unit labor cost, Germany. So with the same currency, you had a 15, 20, 25%, we call it das Krokodil, because Madame Merkel, when she saw it the first time, she had about 2,000 copies made, and she'd give anybody who would come with whatever reason, she'd come into the office, give her a bunch of copies of that, because she loved the idea that Germany was so moderate in terms of the unit labor costs, and that always the wages had been below the productivity, and therefore they were gaining competitiveness. The other countries were losing it. So now the time of reckoning came, and now they had to devalue with the same currency. You can't have nominal devaluations. You had to go for devaluations in the nominal wages, sometimes nominal, mostly real wages, certainly. So you can't divorce the two, and certainly there the question is, how do you go for the elements of productivity, as Tharman suggested, which are more complex? Now, one of the things that you discussed, and this is the question of that we can't detonate investment. We've now said, well, Canada, the U.S. just got 111 billion more spending capacity in the new budget. Korea, Mr. Abe got 2.6% of GDP, of which 0.7 or 0.9% is new. So they're basically spending more, and they got 230% debt to GDP. The U.S. is around 90, and Canada is around 40 or 45. But here you have many different countries. Korea just, again, did it. So what we're saying is there is a space. You mentioned the space. Where does the space come from? Fiscally, the space comes from much lower interest rates. It goes all the way from 0.5% to 2% for the highly indebted. But everybody can use the space, even without going into greater debt, in order to detonate growth. That's one way. Choose high multiplier, well-chosen projects that will break some of the productivity bottlenecks. And then you may even have the paradox that after a couple of years, you go back into the original lower debt to GDP curve. Now, why are we saying that? Did we go crazy? Did we change our tune? No, it's because it's been 8 years that we've been practicing fiscal consolidation. Now things are a lot more stable than they were before, and at the same time, because it's not working. So we probably should be looking for a different mix, but without losing control of the process.
There's a very tricky intersection between the fiscal space and the demographics, because every government has made promises to the people that are aging and approaching
Yes.
retirement, both for health care and for income support, and that limits perhaps some of the fiscal space.
And you
But-
use some of the fiscal space for demographics. yeah.
Right, right.
Yes.
So let's go to the audience and see whether there's some questions. Yes. There's a mic coming.
Several members of the panel talked about demographics, and you mentioned building it into a structural analysis going forward. But isn't it the case that while we're talking about increases in productivity, many of those will come from technology, which will in fact make unskilled and semi-skilled workers unemployable? So in addition to having the aging population that we're going to have to take care of on the far end of life, there's this other population which throughout their lives will also have to be taken care of. And I think perhaps that needs to be structurally built in too, because we're looking at very serious unemployment, I think.
Tharman.
So let me make 2 points. First, a positive story about how technology, globalization can intersect in ways that help to solve the aging problem. Japan, classic aging society, uncompetitive farming sector. Here comes the TPP, which was a bold initiative by Prime Minister Abe to push for the TPP and now to want to ratify it ahead of the largest member of this coalition. So farmers realize competition's coming. Competition in the dairy market, competition in many parts of the farming market. And what's happening now in Hokkaido, in the north of Japan, is they realize they've got 2 problems. First, competition is coming, much more competitive imports. Second, the average age of a farmer in Japan is now 67. They're running out of people. So they've decided to robotize dairy farming. What does it mean? It means, and don't laugh, robots milk the cows extremely efficiently. And the cows find this much friendlier process than human beings, milking them. I've actually seen the photographs, right? Now this also requires, because it requires some investment, it requires some scale. So previously it was small farms, fragmented, everyone surviving as long as they could. They've now gone for consolidation. A younger generation of owners has come in, realized they've got to consolidate, invest in robots. Where do the robots come from? Sweden and Germany. So it's globalization, it's technology, it's solving an aging problem, and they are far more productive than they used to be, and they're confident of meeting imports. So it's a positive story about how globalization and technology are positive solutions for the problems we face. Will we face mass unemployment or unemployment on a significant scale in time to come because of technology? I would say for now, there's so much low-hanging fruit and so much that we can do by way of no regrets policies. If you take the United States, there are 2 stories occurring in the middle of the labor force. One is that of polarization, loss of jobs, the routine cognitive jobs, not just the routine manual jobs. But there's another story in the middle of a very large number of jobs going unfilled. Again, middle-class jobs, jobs requiring skills, going unfilled because employers can't find people with the right skills. So that's surely a space that can be filled with the right public policy action and the right private-public collaborations. Training people, either school leavers or those who are mid-career, with the skills required to fill jobs that do exist on a very large scale. And the same is the case in Europe, the same is the case across the world. there's a mismatch of skills, and plugging that mismatch goes a long way. What will eventually happen in 15 or 20 years from now, no one can tell. No one can tell whether technology this time will displace jobs and not lead to new job creation the way it has always happened. The case for optimism is that that's the way it always happened. Technology displaced some jobs, jobs moved into new industries, new demand was created, and we were all better off because we had no lesser employment, but we had higher productivity. Will it happen again this time? I must admit that I have some doubts in my mind because I'm not sure where the new sources of demand are going to be in a way that creates middle-class jobs. I can think of new sources of demand, but does it create middle-class jobs as opposed to just consumer surplus? What I do with my iPhone is remarkable. Great leap in productivity, but that's consumer surplus. I'm not being paid to use my iPhone. I don't get a wage, and I'm not spending my wage. So there are some interesting questions. I hope history will repeat itself, but I'm not sure it will.
Jean-Claude has an engineering background, right? So perhaps he can...
No, I would say there is an immense paradox in saying simultaneously productivity progress are very slow and will continue to be very slow in the long run on a secular basis. And on the other hand, millions and dozens of millions of jobs are at stake and will be destroyed because the destruction of jobs means that people are available to do something else. Of course, you have the transition, which might be absolutely dramatic, of course. And the stress of our fellow citizens comes out of the rapidity of this transition. But I'm absolutely convinced, again, that, of course, we will, after a certain period, find out the appropriate way of utilizing this fantastic progress in technology. I was told, and it's true for all our countries, if we had the technology of the switchboard at the very beginning of the Bell telephone, and we would utilize today that technology only for the voices and not for the data, all the population would be in the switchboard, plugging and unplugging. So, I mean, it's a question of, we always benefit prodigiously from technology and from the technological surge. The problem is how do you manage the transition? And that is the problem. And I fully agree with both Angel and Tharman that education, retraining is something which is very, very important. That being said, you have necessarily a number of persons that are hurt and feel to be hurt, and they are expressing their frustration.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Can we have another question? Yes, over here.
The wonderful thing about iPhones is you can do searches while you're listening. So I searched OECD on SMEs, and SMEs have not been mentioned. I've been struggling with the question I asked earlier about to the Secretary or to Professor Summers about what can be done to relieve this anger. It seems to me you have an answer at OECD. Promotion of SME financing, especially to create employment and to create export-generating employment, could be a major initiative for policy purposes. And I wonder if you could comment on whether you have looked at this or whether you think there's potential there.
The key to getting SMEs to thrive is to insert them into what today we call global value chains. Mm-hmm. This is how you can get an SME without producing A to Z of a particular product to scale up and to grow. But with cutting-edge technology rather than being an SME and then assuming because it's SME that it has low technology and it's going to, has remained small. But the question is that one of the things we're measuring, we're looking at with great concern, is that even the global value chains, which we've been measuring and seeing growing, thrive, when you talk about the trade, the growth of trade, is that global value chains are kind of being dismantled, or are certainly not growing at same speed. And you have very interesting examples. Why do Italian small and medium enterprises integrate relatively well, or sometimes brilliantly, to the global value chains and end up being exporters, etc., whereas in many other countries global small and medium enterprises do not, and therefore stay small and really do not thrive. And they have to do with the fact that whether they are connected, again, to these longer value chains or not. So the question is credit. The question is, and by the way, when I keep credit, I'm not talking about subsidized credits, low interest rates today. Interest rates are low enough. The question is timely and sufficient working capital, mostly. It's about the small and medium enterprises, it's about getting there. With small and medium enterprises, it's about timely. The question is, again, how do you get to them or provide them with the technology appropriate to the size, appropriate to the scale, and the question of, again, how do you get the large companies to integrate with the smaller companies? How do you get the trade unions, how do you get the government to concert into making that happen? Because you need leaders in the economies that will then bring the others and join them. Why is it that we're losing trade growth or less global value chains? Well, because there's much greater integration. Everybody at the top is fully integrated, and what they do, instead of asking the others to provide them with things, is buy them, incorporate them into the, also because they have their money lying around and they don't want to take it back, they don't want to pay taxes and whatever, that's the tax story. So they buy all these companies, but the thing is that you have to do this very deliberate. And then skills. We do not believe or think that small and medium enterprises, I see Enrique Garcia here, Latin America is all about small and medium enterprises, Africa is all about small and medium enterprises, most of Asia is about small and medium enterprises. It's still, most of the companies in the United States or even in Europe are small and medium enterprises, and therefore, how do you get the skills, so that they can thrive? So these are inputs into what I would call the takeoff, the success. And by the way, it's always been the case, but we did not have the worldwide structure of production through global value chains, which we have now, and therefore the more obvious answer is insert them into those processes.
I think we've run out of time. Is that right, Randy? We're about out. So join me in thanking the panel. I think the